You got your preferences. You were reared in the place you were reared. You have the education you have. You had the parents you have. Everybody's different. Everybody brings their own biases to history. So you're not neutral. And so you're going to interpret history the way you want to interpret it. And everybody's that way. So we can't really know for sure what happened. What about our lack of neutrality? It is true that we all come from different backgrounds, but we can mitigate our lack of neutrality. And now remember why we're talking about all this. This may seem a little bit nitty-gritty, but the reason we're talking about this is because there are people who say you can never know that the resurrection occurred because you can't establish any historical facts, because you're biased or you're not neutral, or maybe nobody can know any facts whatsoever. So let's talk about this neutrality issue. How do you mitigate your own biases and lack of neutrality? Because I admit, I don't come to history the same way anybody else does. Because I have my own background, you have your own background. Surely we have different beliefs about some things, different preferences, different desires. So how do we mitigate that? Well, Michael Licona, who actually believes in the resurrection, by the way, a very noted historian, wrote his PhD dissertation about this question, overcoming lack of neutrality. And here's what he said. You've got 6 ways to do it. Isn't that a phrase? It's not, is it 7 ways from Sunday or 6 ways? What's the phrase? 7 ways from Sunday? Okay, well, he's got 6 ways from Sunday to overcome your neutrality, or your lack of neutrality. Proper historical method. In other words, historians have a method, a mechanism for establishing the facts. We'll talk about that. There is public acknowledgement of one's own horizon and methodology. In other words, when you write about history, what you say is, here's my background. I know that I don't come from the same background everybody else does, but here's the question I'm trying to answer, so that your cards are on the table. You're not trying to sneak anything by anybody. You subject your work to peer pressure and review. In other words, you let other historians look at what you do. And if they say, no, this is bunk, you're wrong on this point, then you go back to the drawing board and you try to figure out where you went wrong. Peer pressure and review. Then you submit your hypotheses to hostile experts. In other words, you don't just pick out people you know agree with you. You don't just pick out people who share your similar background. You send it to a variety of people. Let a variety of people. That's how historians work. You don't just say, I'm the only one who gets to say anything, and I'm right no matter what anybody else says. You submit it to review. Then there are presence of minimal facts. There are things that people accept. Now, when it comes to the resurrection, we have presented our 4 minimal facts. Now, it's up to us to decide what historical explanation explains those 4 facts: the empty tomb, the resurrection appearances, the burial, and the sudden conversion of the disciples. Those are our minimal facts. So you start with your minimal facts, and then you say, here's my historical hypothesis for how to explain those. This is just like the scientific method when they do experiments. You probably learned about the scientific method in middle school or maybe even elementary school, where you get a hypothesis. You know how this goes. You get a hypothesis, and then you put it to the test. You say, is my hypothesis confirmed or is it disconfirmed? And that's the same way with history. Say, I've got my hypothesis. Will the facts that we know support it? And then he says, you'd make your own personal serious effort to detach from your biases. And say, for example, I may wish that the resurrection did not occur because I don't want to be a Christian. But that's not the question. Not do I wish. My wish doesn't enter into it. Like, I may wish that history were different from what it is, but my wish doesn't enter into it. In other words, like my ancestors, for example. I've got some ancestors that did some crazy things. For example, if you go back and if you read one of these books about, they call them like bad wives or wives who murdered their husbands, then I do have, as one of my closer than I would like to admit, relatives who killed about 5 husbands. And she did it for the insurance money. Okay, well, let's say I'm being a historian. Don't get nervous. I don't think I got that gene. I hope I didn't get that gene. But now think about this. Nanny Doss is her name, D-O-S-S. I want to be transparent. If you want to look her up, Nanny Doss is kin to me. And she was a rascal. It's something else. But anyway, I may wish that history were different, But I could not deny that this occurred. There are people who want to deny the Holocaust, for example, and they are letting their bias influence whether they believe this happened. But when we do real historical research, our wish or our preference about what should have occurred, what we would like to think occurred, doesn't enter into it. You see? And so when we talk about the resurrection, there are some historians who admit the facts, and they admit that the resurrection is the best explanation for the facts. But we're going to see they then deny it for one reason or another. Very often they have a bias against the supernatural. They have a bias against believing a miracle could occur. But that bias is no better than any other bias. And that bias doesn't determine what historically happened, even any more than my desire that I don't have a murderess in my family tree would make that go away. It just happened. So, how do we avoid our how do we mitigate our lack of neutrality? Well, first we said there are sound ways of mitigating it. And we gave 6 ways from Michael Licona. And then there are sound criteria for justifying historical hypotheses. That is, historians have ways of weeding out bad hypotheses. We don't have time to talk about them in detail tonight because we only have about 5 minutes left. So what do? I think I'll tell you what they are, and then I will say more about what they are later. But this is a very standard history book by Seabay and McCullough on how to come up with good historical explanations. Notice, he doesn't believe in the resurrection, so he is not favorable toward Christianity, but he should be. Because after he gives his criteria for picking out a good historical explanation, he talks about the resurrection. In fact, maybe I'll just skip to that, and then I'll come back and maybe tell you about his 6 criteria. Okay, here's what he says about the resurrection. He says, this hypothesis, that is the hypothesis that Jesus came back from the dead, is of greater explanatory scope and power than other hypotheses which try to account for the relevant evidence. But it is less plausible and more ad hoc than they are. That is why it is difficult to decide on the evidence whether it should be accepted or rejected. So he says on a couple of the criteria, the resurrection fares very well. Looks like we should accept it. But then on a couple of the other criteria, the resurrection does not fare very well. Well, let me tell you the ones he says it does not fare very well on, and respond to it briefly. The ones that it does fare well on is what we've said already. It explains all the facts, and it explains the facts perfectly. If you look at the facts that we've established, there is nothing that explains them better than the resurrection from the dead. Where does he say the hypothesis goes wrong? First, he says it's less plausible than the other hypotheses, like the disciples stole the body, or the disciples went to the wrong tomb, or the disciples were mistaken because Jesus really only swooned and he didn't die, so they glorified him as the risen Lord, but he actually never died to begin with. Those types of theories. He says the resurrection is less plausible than those. And then he says it's more ad hoc. Ad hoc means that you make up a hypothesis that fits what you want to believe, but it doesn't explain the data. It's just something that you say, well, maybe this happened, but it doesn't explain the data. Like, I gave you the example a week or two ago about the guy who said maybe Jesus had a twin brother that was fled to Egypt when he was a baby, or was taken to Egypt. And then when Jesus died, he showed up and proclaimed himself to be the risen Lord. That's ad hoc because it explains why people might see Jesus, but there's no evidence to support that that ever occurred. Whenever anybody comes up with a theory, you have to say, what is the evidence that supports that? What supports him having a twin brother? Is there any writing about this twin brother? Is there anybody who ever discovered that this guy who thought he was Jesus was actually a twin or claimed to be Jesus? And so forth. There's just no evidence for it. So we'd say it's ad hoc. Okay, well, what about, let's see. Somehow those slides are not there, but let me just talk about it for a minute. Okay, I thought I had a slide about plausibility and one about ad hoc, but I'll just talk it through for a minute and then we'll dismiss. Let's do the ad hoc first. The only belief you have to add to the facts in order to show that the resurrection is the best explanation is that God exists. Okay? It's just that God exists. If you believe that God exists, then it's no longer ad hoc, because God can create a universe by the word of his power. And God might very well want to raise this person from the dead. If this person is the person who fulfills all this Old Testament prophecy and is bringing the kingdom of God into existence, then it seems perfectly reasonable that God would raise this person from the dead. This is not just anybody being raised from the dead. This is not like some random person who dies and then 3 days later comes back. No, this is a person who carried on a ministry of miracle working, who showed people that he was fulfilling Old Testament prophecy, who predicted that he would die and come back in 3 days, and said that the meaning of his death and resurrection was the salvation of all mankind. In other words, there's a whole context. It's not just like any random Joe Schmo being raised from the dead. Okay? Now, what about plausibility? So that's the ad hoc issue. It's not just anybody happening to be raised from the dead. And if you believe God exists, then it makes perfect sense that this person would be raised from the dead. Okay, there's the ad hoc part. What about the plausibility part? Is it plausible? I think when people say the resurrection is implausible, they mean it's implausible that a person would naturally be raised from the dead. That a person who dies would just, for no apparent reason, come back from the dead. There is no natural explanation for that. And you know, all Christians agree with that. There is no natural way that people can come back from the dead. It doesn't happen naturally. But have we ever claimed that? We've never claimed that Jesus came back from the dead naturally. We've always claimed that a miracle occurred. And now we don't know how miracles work. But if you have good evidence that God exists, see, we have excellent arguments. We've already gone through them in this class. We have excellent arguments that God exists. And so if God can raise someone from the dead, then it becomes very plausible that that could occur. And plausibility is always based on both the background information about the world that we have, about how things are, and the specific evidence. And for the resurrection of the dead, our background information includes the existence of God, who can raise anyone from the dead, and our specific evidence for the case of the resurrection is those 4 facts that we've discussed, and the resurrection explains all of those. So I think we can make a very good case, and we'll talk more about it next time. I'm sorry that the end here is a little brief. We'll talk more about it next time, but the resurrection is quite plausible given that background information about God existing and the 4 facts that we have. Okay, does anybody want to have the last word? Anybody have any question or comment?
You were right about it being 6 ways to Sunday as the term goes.
Okay, well, that's good.
And that just means you examined it so that it can be,
Maybe so.
that even fits even better.
Okay, good. All right, well, thank you very much for your attention. We'll see you next time.